the critique of innovation, the state of innovation, is that we often hear, and the rough shape it's in is entirely wrong. You think
Absolutely.
we're in the most innovative period in history.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're so critical about everything to do with American competitiveness. We don't look at our own strengths, and we base too many policy decisions on myths. For example, right now, the common belief is we stopped innovating. Why? Because we haven't had a new type of automobile so far. But if you look at what we did with social media, we changed the world. Where things are moving faster today than they've ever moved. I mean, the fact that we're connected to our cell phones. We didn't have this technology even a decade ago. We weren't hooked up to the internet the way we were. We weren't communicating by email. The world hadn't become such a smaller place. You know, Ali, my problem is that everywhere I look, I seem to be challenging myth after myth. I'll give you 3 examples. Take university research. You know, talk to any academic and they'll go on about how to get more innovation, we need to throw more dollars at university research. We put $50 billion in a year. We get $2 billion worth of licenses out of it. The system is clogged, it's broken. I wouldn't spend a cent more on it, but I'd fix the system. I'd change the way you commercialize it. The second thing is growth. Whenever there's a problem, we throw money at the big banks and bail out large industries. What we should be doing is focusing on the entrepreneur who create all the new jobs, who make the changes happen. And then what happens is when you start talking about boosting entrepreneurship, we start saying, rah, 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 venture capital is the key to success. Let's throw more money at venture capitalists. We need to bail them out. Wrong. Venture capitalists are not a prerequisite to innovation. It's small startups that do it, and venture capitalists don't invest in startups just like the banks don't loan to small businesses. Then we talk about innovation clusters. The Obama administration is cluster happy. Every second word out of their mouth when it's innovation is about clusters. Well, there's not one example of a top-down cluster anywhere in the world that's ever succeeded in the last 40 years or so. I mean, we keep talking about creating these fancy science parks and tech parks. There have been hundreds of billions of dollars spent globally on it. Not one success anywhere in the world. So all of this political dialogue is based on stupidity, is the word I use.
Okay. So you think that we are innovative. You think there's a problem in getting that innovation into something that is commercially viable.
Exactly. It's these small startups needing to help them scale. If we fix that problem, we'll get more growth and innovation than we've ever done before, but we don't know how to do it. We're focused, again, like I said, when we have those conversations, the idea is throw money at the venture capitalists because the venture capitalists claim credit for all of the growth in the economy. Complete nonsense.
Wow, okay. Right. We're going to hold back our venture capitalists for a minute. Give you some thought.
I wanted to get him worked up a little bit.
No, it's good. It's excellent.
Right.
Just don't calm down in the next few minutes, Josh, because I want to go to John and get your thoughts.
Well, I think one of the big challenges we have in talking about innovation is being clear about what we mean when we use the word. One of my favorite litmus paper tests when preparing for an event like this is to go on Google and Google the word innovation to see how many hits I get. And this morning, you'll probably be not surprised to learn there were about 340 million hits for the word innovation. And that's the good news and the bad news. The good news is that people, I think, are very much focused on it at this moment in history at personal, enterprise, and societal levels. But the bad news is that the word is used so indiscriminately and almost like a magic talisman in so many contexts that it almost fades into a meaninglessness. So when I have conversations with people as a card-carrying, innovation-engaged person, the first question I always ask is, what do you mean by innovation? Because it's a complex phenomenon. You have the innovation at almost the psychological and individual level. You know, Steve Jobs is an innovative human being, let's say. Well, then you have the innovation that comes from hot teams. You have the innovation that comes from great enterprises, companies. And then increasingly, I think we're looking at society as the unit of analysis for innovation as well. So the term large-scale innovation, which you can blame me for, was an attempt to say it's a societal phenomenon, and it shouldn't simply be the province of political scientists and economists to describe, because when you look around the world now, many, many countries are in the innovation game. My institute now sponsors a community which has 37 countries worth of national chief innovation officers meeting simply to try to create alignment around definitions of what is innovation. So the dictionary defines innovation as creativity applied to some purpose to realize value. And the value could be financial value or social value. So we're all creative, but our creations aren't necessarily valuable. I think we could take that for granted. And I thought that was a pretty good definition until I started spending time with people who are running innovation in countries. And you know, a country isn't necessarily in the business of coming up with something new that they can realize economies of scale on to generate earnings per share growth so that you know, the company grows and leads to executive bonuses and a bump in stock price. You know, societies are in the business of pursuing the human adventure, providing for the welfare of their citizens, and in some respects, addressing some larger sense of human purpose. So I like the definition of innovation as a set of capabilities that allows for the realization of the future that you want, the desired future. It's aspirational. If you just have a bunch of innovation here, there, and everywhere, you get novelty, you get value around the compass. But if you have a purpose, you get transformation. And the other key point in the definition is the word capability. I believe that innovation, whether it's at the psychological, interpersonal, enterprise, or national level, ultimately requires the same level of attention and practice that learning how to play the piano does. You know, if I said to Vivek, I don't think he plays the piano, you know, you're going to give a piano recital tomorrow, you know, he could get the Cliff's Notes, he could get the outline of, you know, key concepts of how to play the piano, but unless he had practiced for, you know, let's say minimally 5 years, he probably wouldn't be able to deliver that recital. And those of you who know me know that I'm very big on musical metaphors when it comes to innovation. So this notion of practice, of actually grooving in skills, becomes very important. And I'm sure that's what we're going to be talking about when it comes back to talking about the national agenda.
Let's get the piano here tomorrow. I'll show you.
Oh, great. Okay.
That was a smackdown. You are a jazz pianist. I remember.
Well, I've been accused of that. Yeah.
When you and I last met, we were at the X Prize Foundation event in Los Angeles, where we were thinking about problems, but we were very clear on what the problem is you wanted to solve for. So you spend time thinking about the problem, and then you think about the solution for the problem. The issue here with innovation is we're using this as a term, particularly for most people, to solve an economic problem here in the United States, particularly a job creation problem. It's unclear to me whether the capability exists for that, and should that be the purpose that you're saying? You're talking about large-scale innovation having a purpose and being more successful if it has a purpose. Are we fitting a round peg into a square hole by saying that innovation will create jobs in America?
Well, I think that is the $64 question. You know, smart countries around the world have identified a national goal or purpose to which innovation is applied. So if you go to Finland says we're good at design, we're a social welfare state, and we're pretty good at mobility technology, even given the woes of some of the big, you know, companies there in the cell phone business. So the catch line for Finland is we're going to be in the business of assuring the well-being and health of high-risk populations using mobility technology and other forms of connection technology. That's a national goal. When it comes time to talk about driving employment through innovation, I think we have to distinguish between the immediate effects versus the spillover effects. The immediate effects are, and it's been pointed out recently that you know, if you took all of the people in places like in companies like Apple Computer and Facebook and others, they would probably fill Giant Stadium, but maybe not much more than that. And of course, Apple employs over 200,000 people in China, so you know, go figure in terms of a jobs policy. But then the question is, to what extent does innovation drive the spillover, such that ultimately, you know, we move from? I mean, a lot of the employment issue in the United States is really about a structural shift from things we've been very good at, you know, and we have a big kind of incumbents disease right now, which is that we've been so good at so many things and we're so attached to those models that it's been very difficult for us to have the agility to make the transformation, unlike countries, you know, for instance, Germany or Denmark or others that have very well-defined job reskilling, you know, strategic repositioning strategies at the national level.
Okay. Thank you, John. Josh, you are involved in a lot of technologies and a lot of companies as a venture capitalist. Notwithstanding what Vivek said about you guys, but you do invest in these companies for return, and it's not necessarily your intent or the problem that you're solving for to find companies that are necessarily going to solve our economic problems or our employment problems in the United States. Give me your perspective on what's going on, and broader than just that, where you think we stand in terms of innovation.
It is an unintended consequence, of course, job creation, economic creation, wealth creation from startups. It is a phenomenon that I don't think will ever go away, which is that all success in venture-backed companies and startup innovation comes from failures, massive amounts of failures. I want to turn to Vivek's comment earlier because it was an inspiration for this idea that when you take $50 billion of spending from up high and you only get $2 billion, a 4% success rate, that's a phenomenal success rate. 4% is a phenomenal success.
4% based on 60 years of investment, cumulative.
Right, and I believe that that is a wonderful thing for society because
You're talking
the
about
vast majority,
0.01% at best.
the vast majority of spending, the vast majority of entrepreneurs, the vast majority of scientific papers, the vast majority of scientists fail. The ones that succeed are the ones that go on and change the world, and they are very difficult, if not nearly impossible, to predict who they will be. You know, I love the quote that the best way to predict the future is to invent it. And I also love the quote that the future is here, it's just unevenly distributed. Our job as venture capitalists is to go find the individuals that are inventing that future and get it widely distributed. And we have to talk to, and we have to kiss lots of frogs, and very smart people may end up failing, and very not so smart people may end up succeeding, and there's an enormous amount of luck. The promotional aspects of an entrepreneur, multiple technologies being invented at simultaneous times at different places, the adjacent possible between two different areas of technology. It is a very difficult and complex way to create innovation. I do not believe that it can be directed from up top. I agree entirely with Vivek on that point. The idea of clusters have always been a top-down failure, utter failure, completely agree. And the way I believe that clusters can create innovation in the country, around the world, is people rallying around success stories. People rally around narratives. MIT created a brilliant model of this. You get young postdocs, you get young scientists that want to be like their heroes, whether that's a Bob Langer or a George Whitesides or a Paul Alivisatos, these brilliant people who become rich and renowned and attract young people that want to be like them. They rally around success stories. Venture capitalists are greedy types. I love the quote that in greed and avarice lies the hope of progress. We go and we fund lots of experiments, and we run around to entrepreneurs, and we write checks, and hundreds of companies get funded. 99% of them fail. And the ones that succeed go on and change the world and make fortunes. And they are not predictable beforehand. On the point of academia being broken or not, I think it is a wonderful system. Ever since the creation or the allocation through Bayh-Dole of university intellectual property from our tax dollars going in and creating an asset that us as venture capitalists can invoke to others to say, no, you cannot practice in this area. It is a negative right imposed on you. It is a patent. It forms some intellectual barrier. And it's quite interesting in the kinds of things that are funding. Because social media and internet and networking is an amazing phenomenon societally. It is as yet unclear whether this will be enormously financially lucrative to investors. And there's a simple reason for that. If you take a phenomenon like Groupon, is that innovation? Coupons? 500 competitors, how do you pick a winner in that space? If you're intellectually honest, either you spray and pray, you invest in dozens of lottery tickets, if not hundreds of them. Each one a low probability, high magnitude payoff, the odds of being right very low, collectively a very, in aggregate, expensive proposition. The alternative is wait and pay, which you see some very famous venture capitalists and prominent investors doing. Pay a very high price. High valuation, lower expected return, higher probability of success. In most of the things that we invest in, which tend to be spun out of MIT, Harvard, Caltech, the hard sciences, there are between 0 and 6 competitors. And you have to ask why. Why is it easier to be a little bit more arrogant in the security selection, in picking the entrepreneurs, the winners? And we found, at least we think, that it's 3 things. The scientific or technical complexity is high. It's a barrier in itself. The intellectual property moats may be wide. The negative rights to prevent people from practicing. And most importantly, as one of my partners says, we invest in 2-legged mammals, in people. And the labor pool, the scarcity of talent, is the best barrier that you can have. It's why you don't have multiple Steve Jobs or Larry Ellisons or Bill Gates, and it's why they are the heroes in the narratives that we rally around. By definition, they are the black swans. They are the rare and the improbable, and they are the most valuable.
We can come back to this in a little while then, because I'm trying to reconcile what you've all been saying about what involvement we should have in fostering technologies that we should be involved in. To what degree does the market make that determination, and where does something like Solyndra come into play in this discussion, where you know, our politicians are desperately hanging on to the fact that why don't we use public money to foster things that we should be good at, that the market hasn't taken by the horns, and what happens when that failure occurs?
Very, very quickly.
Yeah.
Risk capitalists invest in things that are uncertain, so we do that stage right out of university, trying to build a company. The government has a role, taxpayers, society has a role in funding basic science, basic research, because the market mechanism may not exist to take that on. Beyond that point, my view is that government should not be involved in picking winners, in giving loan guarantees, in funding things that are not in themselves economical. Leave that to the market. So Solyndra, which is now becoming a highly politicized and maybe rightly so case, is going to be a mark for alternative energy for some. It's going to be it's something drawn out in the press. The government does have a role. Societies, whether it's the U.S. or others, have a role in funding basic science. You see it happening in China. You see it happening elsewhere in a voracious kind of way. What you don't see elsewhere is the capital market system that we have here. The ownership of intellectual property, the risk-taking, the reward that accrues to investors for taking that risk, and capital markets, stock markets, that are willing to buy shares of those companies for an uncertain future. That is the most valuable thing after the invention of the technology.
Okay, that's good. That's going to be a good discussion to come back to, because energy is one of these places where innovation and public policy cross roads, and an important one. Thom, your comments, please.
I guess the first thing that I think we really need to point out is that what we're talking about is how to extract value from ideas. And in the end, I think a society that is innovative is first and foremost a society that educates people. That's where the good ideas come from. Now, that's necessary, but it's not sufficient. So much of this conversation is about mechanisms. How do you translate those ideas into value? And the best example I know of necessary but not sufficient is to look back at the Cold War and say, here you had two societies that were educating their people, and one of them out-innovated the other. So education is not sufficient. And that's where you get into these discussions of things like tech transfer. Is it broken? Is it not? And so forth. I think there is an appropriate government role in basic research. That is something that markets will not readily take up. You can't even predict what industries you will have an impact in when you start down that path. But governments are not good at taking those next steps. And in fact, with all the debate about Solyndra, that shows you consequences of failure. One of the challenges, you can also get in trouble for success. The best example I know of this is recently there's been a lot of discussion, obviously, on budget deficits and spending reductions. And so the National Science Foundation has been trying to explain why they should receive public investments, going around Capitol Hill, highlighting some of their successes. One of the ones they like to point out is that Google was started with a National Science Foundation grant to Stanford. Not huge licensing revenues to Stanford, so I don't believe you should use licensing revenue as your proxy for value here. The remarkable thing is that they got into trouble with that, at least with some people who said, hey, wait a minute, why is there a public investment that's turning into wealth generation for private individuals? That's unacceptable. Now, I think that's the wrong answer, and I think we need to explain why it is that public sector investments on the very front end are the only way you're going to get those new ideas. And then, yes, government does need to step back. Yes, it does need better mechanisms for a smooth handoff, but actually we can tolerate success, and we can tolerate failure as well.
While we don't usually face this problem, because usually the private sector and innovators are ahead of what government would be doing, again, I come back to this issue of Solyndra and energy and alternative energy in this country. What happens when the capital markets do not seem to have embraced forms of innovation that appear to be politically and economically necessary for us?
Well, I think the biggest problem in energy, and it's obviously Oak Ridge National Lab, that's what we do for a living, is that private markets can easily embrace the need for innovation if they have clear economic drivers and clear signals.
Right.
And to some extent, I think we are trying perhaps to substitute the inability at a public policy level to create those clear market signals for other sorts of incentives that may be more politically palatable but ultimately less effective. I mean, to put it bluntly, if we're worried about CO2, then we need to build that into the economics. Betting on Solyndra or anyone else in the absence of that economic driver is going to lead to failures. Right.
And the trying to put that into the economics has not been successful.
It doesn't seem to be going anywhere very fast right now.
Okay. Nicolas Negroponte.
Well, with John here, who's given a very good definition, I won't try to elaborate, except to say that I do see a lot of people, when we talk about innovation, who kind of confuse creativity and invention and kind of lump it in and say, sort of take that to business school and do add some risk capital. I think it's a much deeper cultural phenomenon. I think, I'll give you a very specific example, I think you get innovation in a heterogeneous environment. So when I go to Korea and they say we want to be innovative, but we're going to be xenophobic at the same time, I say, well, you know, that doesn't work, and come back when you think differently. I think that a lot of rote learning, which is most of the world actually, just wipes it out of you. You become this robotic sort of thing, you memorize, you do this and that, and people don't understand that perspective is worth many points of IQ. And that the people who are innovative in my sense, they may not have the business models, they may not have the charisma to get funded by a venture capitalist, but they are the people who are prepared to be counterintuitive, compared to sort of basically fly in the face of common sense. And I'm fond of reminding people that common sense is common. And the most odious question I get is when people say, why don't you be realistic? Well, that's where innovation comes from not being realistic and doing things that are a little bit out on the edge. And I'll just tell you a story and preface it by saying that I think the worst disease in this world is nationalism. If we didn't have nationalism, we'd have a much better world. So when we talk about innovation helping the American economy, I sort of want to puke a little bit because we're less than 5% of the world, and we're not the part of the world that needs to really move that far ahead. Let's start looking at Africa and the developing world, and that's really where you want these engines to take hold. So I'm not particularly interested in Massachusetts being economically ahead of Connecticut, and likewise, I'm not concerned about the United States being economically ahead of somebody a little further over, whether it's Mexico or China. So let's think of it as one world that can be innovative. And so the story I'm going to tell you is when I founded Wired magazine, or I was one of the founders, I wrote the back page. One of the first back page stories I wrote was why Europe isn't innovative. And my parents were hyper-European, lived in Europe, spoke multiple languages. My father corrected the Trivial Pursuit cards when we played the game. It was a relationship that was, again, partly because of age, partly because of being European, was a kind of a much more formal relationship, hardly the one I have with my son or hardly the one he has with his son. But he said, you know, I didn't really like your story because what you said about Europe isn't true. And so I said, okay, well, let's after dinner, because it was there were bullets in the story, let's go through the bullets. And the first one was about centralism, and that the centralism of thinking really hurt innovation, that you needed a more decentralist bottom-up instead of a top-down view of the world. And he said, no, Europe isn't centralist, and we don't suffer from centralism. He was my father, and I didn't want to argue. So we went on to the next bullet. The next bullet was risk capitalism, or people who take risks. And he said, no, my friends in Brussels, you know, they take all sorts of risks, and there's lots of risk capital. And finally, I'm not going to argue again. So we get to the last bullet. And the last bullet was that Europeans don't listen to their young. And he laughed. He said, why should we? And I said, got it. And that was it. In other words, you need a deep cultural difference that does listen to the young, that does listen to weigh out ideas, that doesn't just turn off and look to people for their station in life and where they sit, not what they do and how they think. So it's a big cultural phenomenon.
Are we all of the view, Vivek pointed out, one of the problems in academia is the bureaucracy in it, the clogged nature of the system, the inability to get some of these great ideas out there and make money. Nicolas, the MIT Media Lab, has been very good about sort of combining this basic research that, Thom, you were involved in at the AT&T labs, that type of research that you just do because it's good to do and you know something good will come out of it, with commercial application in the end. But are we all of the idea that innovation, as we have come to describe it here on this panel, is not really broken? Does anybody here think it's broken? That we're not doing enough for the right things?
You know, I agreed with everything Vivek said except this 50 versus 2 billion. There are two things to consider about research in universities. Mm-hmm. first is it's the only place, you can't do this at ANTT, you can't do it at Oak Ridge, you can have 30 projects, 29 of which fail.
Right.
And the reason that is because we have another product line called students, degrees, education. And students learn just as much from the failures, in fact, perhaps more than the successes. So at the Media Lab, only 1 out of 30 or 1 out of 40 have to come close to succeeding.
Right.
And the second is the income from licensing is irrelevant. It's not, in fact, the Media Lab doesn't even take licensing fees. We give it free to our sponsors purposely. And I always get annoyed at MIT at running this little cottage industry where they sort of get license fees, but the provost loves it because it goes into his pocket, really, instead of the labs and the people, and so, or at least it's distributed, skewed in that way. So I think the licensing fees is not the right measure. I think the right measure is the penetration of the idea. Now, MIT was one of the key places that invented the internet, and I was actually there at the time. It was actually a time when I knew every single person on the internet. That's pathetic, isn't it? The interesting thing is nobody made a dime. Okay, nobody made a dime off these things, no university did, but boy, it had things, artificial intelligence, social networks, they had huge impacts. And I hope the 50 becomes 100 billion that pours into it, and I'm sure you do too, but licensing fees, that's like measuring patents as a measure of creativity. You know the city that has the most patents per capita in the whole world? It's Basel. Okay, it's a lovely city, but you know, it's not the epicenter of creativity and innovation.
Right. I think this point about students being the other product line is extremely important. When I was at Bell Labs, one of my colleagues, Dave Bishop, used to say that tech transfer is the moving van from MIT to Murray Hill. Actually, he may have said from Cornell to Murray Hill because he was a Cornell player. And you see this also as if you look at these clusters, the real ones, the ones that grew up organically. There was a study done by an economic development group around Cambridge University in the UK a couple of years ago that was trying to understand, what causes our area to prosper around technology-based innovation. What could we do to enhance it and so forth. And of course, as with all these studies, the first thing they concluded is that it is not Silicon Valley, right? And that's true for every other place in the world. And then they, talked about access to capital and so forth. But the thing that they identified, which I thought was quite interesting, was that the tech-based innovation in the Cambridge area was not based on intellectual property coming out of Cambridge University. That was not what drove it. It was based on people who came out of Cambridge University. Now, they'd had contact with a great research institution. In many cases, they were former postdocs and graduate students, so that was part of their intellectual growth. But the IP was not something that Cambridge licensed and received licensing fees, but that was driving the economy. An important, for Europe, actually, one of the real outliers in terms of European innovation is that region, and it's the people.